Long before the phrase pumping iron became part of our everyday fitness vocabulary, it was the title of a low-budget documentary that would defy the odds to become a cult classic. On the 25th anniversary of that film, Cinemax presents the story behind the making of Pumping Iron, the film that introduced the world to a charismatic 28-year-old bodybuilding champion known as Arnold. With never-before-seen outtakes from the film,
the only thing that's left is Arnold's bullshit.
as well as candid comments from the cast and crew 25 years after the film was released.
But at the time when I first saw it, I was like mortified, saying, oh my God.
I went overboard many times.
We were really struggling to get the movie made, and people were laughing at us.
Cinemax presents a tale of sweat, muscle, ego, and glory in the golden age of bodybuilding. Raw Iron, the making of Pumping Iron. February, Columbus, Ohio. Arnold Schwarzenegger is in town for the Arnold Classic, the annual bodybuilding competition he's produced since 1976. Along with Mr. Olympia, it's the premier contest in the sport. Bodybuilding has come a long way since Pumping Iron was released in 1977. The contestants are bigger than ever, and so is the stage show. The Arnold Classic is an extravaganza to rival any big-ticket rock concert. And bodybuilding's become big-ticket too. These days, more than 175,000 bodybuilders compete in 169 countries. Today, Schwarzenegger is here to hand out more than $400,000 in prizes. But he's also here to see some old friends who have gathered backstage. Many of the original bodybuilders from the Pumping Iron era. Bill Grant, Ed Corney, Mike Katz, Franco Columbu, and Lou Ferrigno.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you. Terrific.
There was camaraderie. We helped each other. We trained each other. We were a part of a family.
Where's your son? Where's Michael?
Right there.
Michael, come over here.
Good.
How's it going? Okay, good to see you. 25 years ago, we saw in Pumping Iron, we saw the little Michael. He was 3 years old. And then he made you pose. Remember, he made you hit shots.
Ooh, it's hard. Feel this muscle, how hard that is.
Just everyone is so huge. What's going on here? I'm the...
Still got it. 25
Can you
years
believe
later.
that?
Pumping Iron. It changed my whole life.
Are you going to give him all the wrong advice?
It's not that hard for me to give him the wrong advices.
No, only the right advice.
It was so much fun and enthusiasm.
Great. Oh.
It was incredible.
Let me tell you, she said, now she's his mother talking about my mother. He's talking about pumping up.
He's talking about pumping up. He's talking about psyching me out. He couldn't shut me up then. He can't shut me up now. No, it's always the same. Nothing has changed.
Whenever I think back on the Pumping Iron days in the 1975 when we did this movie, I definitely miss it.
Back before Pumping Iron, he was known as the Austrian Oak, but he was unknown outside the marginal and misunderstood sport called competitive bodybuilding.
It was a tiny little world, and 300 people would come to the contest that night. They would go crazy over Arnold Schwarzenegger, so he was king of 300 people. Wow. It's just that Arnold hadn't burst out of that world yet.
Photographer George Butler and writer Charles Gaines were fascinated with the bodybuilding subculture and collaborated on a book they called Pumping Iron, which featured the young Austrian bodybuilder. Butler wanted to turn it into a film, but Arnold wanted to retire. Since moving to America in 1968, he'd won the sport's top prize, Mr. Olympia, an unprecedented 5 times, and he'd had enough.
George Butler came to me and says, I have a great idea. We should do a movie, but it only will work if you're in it. And if you retire now, you can't be in it, so that doesn't work.
Butler knew the weird and wacky world of bodybuilding had all the makings of a fascinating movie, but how to get investors aboard, it would be a tough sell. It was, after all, the 70s, the height of the counterculture revolution. The last thing on anyone's mind was muscle men.
It gave me a very formidable obstacle to overcome, which is to say, how do I make Arnold Schwarzenegger fashionable in the era in which the most celebrated model in the world was Twiggy? In the back of my mind, I knew that throughout history, there had always been at least one worldwide bodybuilder. Sandow, at the turn of the century, was one of the highest paid entertainers in the world. Charles Atlas in the 20s and 30s. Steve Reeves in the 50s made a fortune in the movies.
After convincing Arnold to compete for one more Mr. Olympia title, first-time director Butler jumped headfirst into filmmaking.
Okay, you got the 8? 8. Head slate.
Just talk to these two guys here.
The concept was simple. Shoot the intense training leading up to the Mr. Olympia, then shoot the competition itself. Just let the story unfold in front of the camera. He started by shooting a test film for investors. In this never-before-seen footage, the first frames ever shot for Pumping Iron, Arnold pumps up backstage for a posing exhibition.
Wenn Nixon gets impeached.